Today we are going to talk about angles and equations, and during this we're going to have to solve for x. So we're going to look at a bunch of examples, but the steps that we need to follow are: first we need to determine the angle relationship. So the angles that are labeled, are they complementary, supplementary, are they congruent? And based on that, then step 2 we're going to write an equation, and then at step 3 we're going to solve for x in our equation using inverse or opposite operations. So pause if you need to, and we're going to move into our first example. So our first example here, we have our two parallel lines with our transversal, and I'm going to label a couple of angles. We have this angle here, x plus 139, and then we have this angle here, 132 degrees. So our first step is to determine the angle relationship. Are these complementary, are these supplementary, or do they add up, or are they congruent? So I know off the bat that this is not complementary because I don't see anything that would mean 90 degrees. I don't see any of those little boxes that mean 90 degrees, nothing about right angles. So then I have to decide, are they supplementary, do they add up to 180, or are they congruent? Well, I see that I have this Z pattern here. And remember, that's for our alternate interior angles. So that tells me that these are congruent. So alternate interior angles are congruent. So I know that these two angles are the same. Another way that you could look at it is looking at the two sizes of angles. This 132 is the bigger obtuse angle, and 139 is also an obtuse angle. So we know that they're going to be the same because they were both the bigger angles. Remember, in these pictures where we have the two parallel lines, everything is either one number or the other. There's only two options. Either it's the big angle or it's a small angle. So they were both big angles, so that's another way to know that they were congruent. So when we write our equation, I'm going to take my two angles, x plus 139 and 132 degrees, and I'm going to set them equal to each other because we know they're equal. So now I have to solve for x. We have x plus 139, so instead of plus 139, I do the opposite and I subtract on both sides. Now you might want a calculator nearby. You can also just find one online. Remember, there's that one in the resources on Buzz, or you can just look up a calculator. But when I do subtract 139, I have just x left on the left side, and then on the right, 132 minus 139 gets me negative 7. So I found that x is negative 7 degrees. Moving on to our second example. So again, I have my two parallel lines cut by a transversal, and I have one angle that's labeled 8x and another angle that's labeled 32. So again, first step, find out the angle relationship. Again, I don't see any 90-degree angles here, so I know that complementary has nothing to do with this. So I need to decide, are these supplementary or do they add up to 180, or are they congruent angles? So let's talk vocab for a second. If I look at these four angles and I look at these four angles, you'll notice that the 32 and the 8x are in the same spot. They're both in that left angle, the one most furthest to the left. So they're in the same spot, which means they are corresponding angles. You need to know your vocab. But again, for the purpose of solving for x, you could have looked at the angles and said, oh, well, this is a small angle, this is a small angle, so they must be congruent. But we know corresponding angles are congruent. So corresponding angles are congruent. We already knew that. And so I know that these two are equal to each other, so I can write my equation 8x is equal to 100, or just 32. So 8x equals 32. Again, I set them equal to each other because corresponding angles are congruent. They're both the small angle in the picture. So all I have to do is the opposite here. I have 8 times x. The opposite of multiplying is divide. So when I divide both sides by 8, I get x equals 4. And our third example, again, 2 parallel lines and our transversal. We must decide first, what kinds of angles are these? Are they complementary, supplementary, or congruent? So starting with complementary, again, no right angles here, so not complementary. So we have to decide supplementary or congruent. So I have 104x labeled. It might be easier for you, this is another way to figure out if they're supplementary or congruent, to label the ones you do know. So I know, for example, that this one is also 100 degrees because those are vertical angles right across from each other. And if you want to label the whole picture, you can. So if this straight line has to add up to 180, then I know the missing portion is 80. So then this other side would be 80. And this pattern will repeat down below as well. So we would have 80, 100, 80, and 100. So you can label the whole picture to help you figure it out, and then you know that this 4x angle is 80 degrees. Or you could look at the angles. Here, my 100 degrees, that's a bigger angle, it's obtuse. And I have 4x, which looks like it's a smaller angle, it's acute. So I know that the two of them together have to add up to 180, because we know all of these pictures are either congruent or they add up to 180. These two angles clearly are not congruent because one's small and one's big, so I know they must add up to 180. So a couple ways you can solve this. I did label 4x as 80 degrees, so I could say 80 equals 4x and just divide by 4 and be done. Because we had 4 times x, so I did the opposite and I divided by 4. Or, and that gets me the answer, x equals 20. Or I could use our supplementary fact here that I have 4x and 100 degrees next to each other on a straight line. So I know that 4x plus my 100 degrees adds up to 180 degrees, and then we solve from here. Get rid of the plain number first, so subtract 100. And I get 4x equals 180 minus 100 is 80. And look, I'm back to the other equation I solved. So just divide by 4. And either way I solve this, I get x equals 20. So that was 2 different ways to solve this last problem.